Do you know that in 1663, in some counties of Joseon, Korea, more than half the registered population were legally classified as property? Do you know that this system lasted for nearly 1,000 years? Do you know that it was hereditary, that being born to a Nobi mother meant your children and their children were slaves for life? And do you know that almost no one outside Korea has ever heard of it? This is the story of the Nobi, Korea's enslaved class, and the nearly 1,000-year system that the world forgot. For decades, Western translations of Korean historical texts softened the reality of the Nobi. Translators often euphemistically labeled them as servants, serfs, or bondsmen. But the legal codes of the Goryeo and Joseon dynasties leave no room for ambiguity. Nobi were chattel property, completely stripped of independent legal personhood. They were bought, sold, and traded at markets, just like livestock or land. A healthy adult Nobi could be traded for a high-quality horse or a few bolts of silk. They were gifted as wedding presents, bequeathed in wills, and confiscated by the state to pay tax debts. Unlike serfs in medieval Europe, they were not permanently tied to a specific piece of land. Their owners could move them, separate them from their families, or lease their labor to others. The distinction was absolute. You were either a free subject of the king, or you were the property of another. And there was no middle ground in the eyes of Joseon law. Slavery was not introduced to Korea by foreign conquest or colonial expansion. It grew organically from within, evolving into an industrial-scale social institution. The system took firm root during the Goryeo Dynasty, which began in 918, but it reached its terrifying zenith during the Joseon Dynasty from 1392 onward. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the numbers swelled to unprecedented proportions. Historians estimate that out of a total population of around 12 million up to 5 million were enslaved. In some southern agricultural provinces, the Nobi population reached as high as 60%. This made Joseon, Korea one of the most densely enslaved societies on the planet. The scale rivaled the plantation economies of the Caribbean or the American South. Yet all of this happened within a racially homogeneous society, isolated on a peninsula. The enslavers and the enslaved were ethnically identical, separated only by invisible lines of legal status. The Nobi system was divided into two vast architectures of ownership. The first were the Guan Nobi, the public slaves owned directly by the state. Numbering in the hundreds of thousands, they maintained the sprawling government bureaucracy. They forged weapons, built palaces, maintained relay stations, and manufactured the paper used for government decrees. The state viewed them as a limitless, free public utility, but the vast majority were sa Nobi, private slaves owned by the Yangban, the aristocratic elite. Wealthy Yangban families sometimes owned hundreds, even thousands of human beings. Private Nobi were further divided by their living arrangements. Residential Nobi lived within the master's compound, subjected to constant surveillance and domestic demands. Tribute-paying Nobi lived independently, farming their own plots of land. They enjoyed the illusion of autonomy, but owed a crushing annual quota of cloth, grain, or labor to their master. And at any moment, the master could call them in, sell them off, or seize their children. To sustain a slave population of millions without importing captives, the state needed a biological engine. They found it in the legal code of 1432, famously known as the Nobi Jongmobeop. This law established a strict rule of matrilineal descent for the enslaved. If a mother was a Nobi, her child was a Nobi for life, regardless of the father's status. If a free commoner man married an enslaved woman, their children instantly became the master's property. For the wealthy Yangban elite, this was a highly profitable demographic strategy. Masters actively encouraged their enslaved women to marry free peasant men. Every child born to these unions was free labor added to the master's estate. The law transformed the wombs of enslaved women into factories for aristocratic wealth. Over generations, this legal trap systematically drained the free commoner class. Slowly but surely, a massive percentage of the Korean population was pulled into the abyss of hereditary servitude. For a residential Nobi, survival required navigating a world entirely devoid of legal protection. A Nobi could not testify in court against their master, rendering them legally invisible. Physical discipline was entirely at the discretion of the owner. While murder of a slave technically required government permission, masters who killed their Nobi rarely faced serious consequences. Marriage could only occur with the explicit approval of the owner. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women by masters was rampant, normalized, and carried absolutely no legal penalty. Education was strictly forbidden. Teaching a Nobi to read classical Chinese was seen as a threat to the natural order. Nobi were deliberately excluded from the Confucian moral hierarchy that governed the rest of society. They were not considered full subjects capable of filial piety or civic virtue. Yet, ironically, these very same people produced the cultural artifacts that defined the era. The exquisite white porcelain, the delicate silk garments, the grand wooden temples, all built by hands that owned nothing. Faced with lifetime servitude, tens of thousands of Nobi chose the only remaining option: escape. The deep mountains of the Korean peninsula offered hiding places for those willing to risk everything. But the Joseon state operated a ruthless, highly organized retrieval system. Specialized government slave hunters, known as chuno, scoured the countryside for fugitives. Neighbors and local magistrates were legally required to report suspicious strangers. A captured runaway faced brutal public punishment designed to terrify others into submission. Flogging was standard, but repeat offenders faced branding on the face. The character for runaway slave would be permanently tattooed in black ink into the skin of their cheek or forehead. Despite these horrors, the sheer volume of runaways began to destabilize the national economy by the 18th century. Entire villages of fugitives formed in the northern provinces, living outside the reach of the law. If this history matters to you, please take 5 seconds to like this video and subscribe to Unshackled History. Leave a comment below letting us know your thoughts and share this story with others. By the late 1700s, the Joseon government faced an existential crisis. The slave system had grown so massive that the state was running out of free commoners to pay taxes and serve in the military. The Yangban aristocrats hoarded their private slaves, exempting them from state duties. Under intense pressure from reformist scholars, the young King Sunjo took drastic action. In the spring of 1801, the king ordered the abolition of the public Nobi system. In a highly theatrical and symbolic act, the official government slave registries were hauled into the courtyards of state ministries. They were set on fire, burning the legal chains of roughly 66,000 human beings. It was a monumental decree, freeing the state's own captives. But the flames in the capital did not reach the estates of the aristocracy. The abolition of 1801 applied only to public Nobi owned by the government. The private Nobi, the vast majority of the enslaved population, remained chained to their masters for nearly another century. It wasn't until 1894 that the entire institution finally collapsed. Under the Gabo reforms, driven by domestic peasant uprisings and mounting pressure from Imperial Japan, the Joseon government formally abolished all slavery. Class distinctions were legally erased, and private Nobi were officially declared free subjects. But this emancipation was a hollow victory for many. The government offered no compensation to the freed slaves and no redistribution of land. The newly freed population found themselves destitute, possessing no property, capital, or education. Most had no choice but to return to their former masters, begging to work as sharecroppers on the exact same fields they had previously worked as slaves. The legal title of Nobi vanished, but the economic reality of servitude persisted deep into the 20th century. The chains were removed from the law books, but they remained forged in the soil. If nearly 40% of a nation was enslaved for a millennium, why is it entirely absent from global history? The answer lies in the trauma of the 20th century. Shortly after the Nobi system was abolished, Korea was violently annexed by the Japanese Empire. The national narrative naturally shifted toward resisting external oppression and surviving colonial brutality. Following liberation, the peninsula was torn apart by the Korean War, leading to decades of desperate poverty and rapid industrialization. In constructing a modern national identity, South Korea focused on narratives of victimization by outsiders and miraculous economic triumph. There was little appetite for confronting the dark, prolonged history of internal exploitation. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, there is no visible racial marker separating the descendants of the enslaved from the descendants of the enslavers. They all share the same names, the same bloodlines, and the same modern cities. Today, the descendants of the Nobi walk the streets of Seoul, Busan, and Pyongyang. Because aristocratic genealogies were widely forged in the 20th century, almost all modern Koreans claim descent from the elite Yangban class. The millions of enslaved ancestors have been quietly written out of the family trees. Yet, the history of the Nobi is not just a Korean story, it is a human story. It proves that the mechanics of slavery do not require racial difference or colonial conquest. Power, greed, and a legal framework are all it takes to turn neighbors into property. The legacy of the Nobi challenges us to look beyond the history we are taught. It forces us to ask how many other massive injustices remain hidden in the shadows of the past, waiting for the smoke to clear. The history of slavery is a vast, global human tragedy, and most of it has never been properly told. If this video opened your eyes, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Click the next video on your screen to keep uncovering the history that was hidden from you.